Everybody, welcome back to the Insiders Lounge. Today we have another special episode and another special guest. Mark, thank you for joining us and feel free to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Mark Kelkenberg. I'm basically just an independent scout, a little bit of a U15, 19 coach, and I advise players around the youth levels and then even at the college level as well. That's how we got in contact. So maybe I'll save the full resume for a little bit later. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect start. We'll get into kind of what happens behind the scenes that people don't see on X and so on from your side, and then we'll also get into kind of the college soccer space and everything involved there. First, let's start with your first soccer memory. Going back, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you?
I mean, honestly, there's like so many. I was even talking to my twin brother this morning because it's been a busy week. I haven't been able to talk to him that much, and we talk pretty much every day. But obviously, growing up as a twin, those are always going to be like the earliest memories. So we grew up in a pretty small farm town, and we had a decent sized plot of land. So I mean, ever since we could run, we were always outside doing stuff. So I think soccer was probably the number one sport just throughout our whole childhood. So yeah, just like playing soccer either in the backyard with our dad or in our basement during winters. Because I mean, for the audience, Chad and I are kind of from the same area, but right across the river. I'm U.S. side, he's Canadian side. So you know how the weather gets.
Especially right about now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a little later in the story, like during high school or middle school. For some of the winters, we'd like look up the weather report to see if there's any, 40-degree and sunny day. And me and my brother, we just like go out in our backyard and shovel like a thin layer of snow, or like to get it down to a thin layer of snow right in front of our net, and then just wait for like the afternoon. And it was just like this perfect bright green rectangle of grass. So we would just be doing like free kicks and 1v1 and stuff like that. So, I mean, between that and a lot of the indoor complexes, it was a year-round thing for sure.
Whenever I talk to people in kind of this like content creation space, I know it kind of has that like stigma around it, but it's true. You're creating content in that space. It's kind of looked at as like a little bit nerdy, a little bit niche in a sense. Like even for myself, creating kind of sports business content in this realm. I'm curious for you, like there's a difference between just like enjoying and watching soccer or football for our European listeners, but then there's like this next level like obsession where you're diving into scouting reports, you're creating your own highlight reels, all these different things. Can you talk to me? I loved hearing the story when we first spoke of like getting into that, and then like was that always like a sign in the early days? Like was it always something like, look, I like soccer way more than just watching it on the weekend?
Yeah, I think like it goes back to when I was in college. So my first degree was in education, and I taught for probably 2 years. And along with that, even like as a senior in college, I would coach club soccer with our men's coach. So I got like exposure. It was kind of funny, like being 6'5" and coaching 4 and 5 year olds and being called like Mr. Giraffe and stuff like that. But, getting that foundation of coaching and like learning from a lot of these like accomplished coaches and their different styles, because he was from the Netherlands. So I got to kind of see the foundation of what a Dutch style is. And so I think that like played a lot into it as well, because not only or you kind of move away from being a fan and like obviously you have your experiences as a player, but you really start to see the game in the more tactical ways. And that's when you like stop shouting at the TV or really getting into it, and you're just like sitting there kind of in a silence, like just over analyzing everything that you're seeing. Like, why are they doing that? Oh man, like they should be doing this type of movement or things like that. So that was like kind of the start of getting away from being like an they're just a fan, and then getting more into like, well, what type of stuff could I talk about or use in my own coaching, and then yeah, the scouting stuff just kind of came about in a whole nother way. It's like the turns and twists throughout my background. It's been kind of interesting. Like I wouldn't have guessed that I'd be doing what I'm doing right now, 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, so let's get into, can you dive into that story a little bit more of
Yeah,
like, we can even talk about like, I almost imagine it like Batman. You sort of got this like daily figure of working a regular job at a bank, but then you've also got this behind the scenes where you're working in scouting and so on and creating content. So let's, if you want to dive into both and kind of how that all got started for you.
yeah. I'll try to like keep it as short as I can
Yeah,
because
yeah.
a relatively long story, but like moving away from education, I ended up finding my way in like some project management type roles, and so I moved to Colorado. Um, Interestingly enough, like I was going to play at a JUCO school with Chris Zitterbart, so that's like how we initially became friends, and then we just kind of stayed in touch over the next few years. But it was kind of funny. I came back from my last like little teaching thing where I'm like, all right, it's not for me. I'm like, well, yo, Zitterbart, are you looking for a new roommate? And he was like, yeah, actually, we're looking to move out of this apartment and we're gonna get a house because Cesar Roldan at the time was um, about to be the trainer for the Colorado Rapids. Now he's with LA Galaxy. Iconic cigar smoking little video with Puig, so that was cool, or Pooch or whatever however
Yeah.
I'm I can't admit that I'm a Galaxy fan, but I'll support him. He's a good dude. But yeah, we like had a really good soccer house. Sean O'Neill, who's still with the training staff with the Rapids, he came on board with our little soccer house, and I mean, it was just a blast. And, obviously when you're living with three of the staff, you go to the games and you hang out with some of the players and stuff. And you get to see how, a little bit more details on how clubs work. And, you overhear conversations and stuff. And that's where, the draft started like really picking up for Chris. And then, I was just like, well, I mean, I'm interested in this stuff. And I was, doing opponent scouting for the one college I was attending for my second graduate degree. So I was getting like more into scouting on that front. And then I started diving into some video. I'm like, I do like some of these players. I might as well just like start making highlight videos for some of the guys I like and in preparation for the draft or whatever, and just helping them maybe get a little bit more exposure. And then at that point, it was only just YouTube. I wasn't doing any writing. And I think that's where, especially last year, it really took off. Like, it was kind of crazy. I ended up doing like probably 10 videos for the Wake Forest program. And it was kind of funny. Like, Garrison Tubbs he messaged me one night. He's like, oh man, like, you made videos for some of my teammates. Like, can you do one for me? And I'm like, dude, I mean, I'm a big fan. I would have already made you one. I just thought you were already set with Atlanta. And he's like, I'm like, is everything good there? And he's like, no, yeah, that's all good. It's for the Mac Herman stuff. And I was like, dang, all right. Well, sounds like you'd probably need it soon. So I actually ended up pulling an all nighter to do it for him and like send it to Bobby or send it to him so he could have it. Bobby sent it over to, the voters or whoever, and he ended up the finalist. So that was good. And obviously he's a pro with DC United now. Really great guy. But yeah, that's where a lot of the popularity came from. And then I'm like, well, there's got to be a better way to kind of share these things. And, making your own blog, stuff like that is like, it's not always easily accessible to the broader soccer community. So, I was never a Twitter guy or anything like that. But I'm like, well, you got to find some outlet. And I thought it was a decent platform for it because it's longer. You can do longer form writing in a way, and share links and things like that. So that's kind of the long story of started with some highlight videos of guys that I liked, started writing more about it and covering more. Um, to what it is now, a lot of draft centric stuff. I'll sneak in some international like U23 players, but that's when it's not, the hot time for getting all these US based players. Um, some more exposure out there, but yeah.
No, that's great. I want to dive into, you mentioned JUCO already there, so I want to dive into like, let's just cover the overall college soccer space for someone that has like no idea. Like I'm sure as like a European or even Canadians looking at the college soccer system, it just looks like complete chaos. There's like all these different divisions, all these different leagues. Can you kind of just dive in and give like a brief summary of sort of what we're looking at in the college space, and then we'll probably dive into a little bit more of the NCAA realm because that's kind of what heads into the draft. But if you can just first give like a general overview of what college soccer looks like.
Yeah, so for sure, it's like I think it viewed around the world as an amateur league. I think I've heard some opinions like, "Oh, what college? Like, what's that? Like, they're amateurs." And you got to like dive into it a little bit deeper than that. Like, I mean, Division One alone has over 200 men's programs, and the way they organize it is just a long list of different conferences. And like for me personally, I think that there's a handful of top or the most highly competitive conferences. Like any team could beat any team on any given day, and that's kind of your ACCs, Big Tens, Sun Belt, and Big East, maybe Atlantic 10. But then you get like, obviously with the College Cup coming up, you get some of these conference winners or other conferences that aren't as notable, but obviously the top teams in those conferences can compete with the most talented conferences. But yeah, like American East, AAC, and like the West Coast ones, West Coast, Western Athletic, and even Ivy League. So yeah, I mean, the way it's organized now is, I think, is about as good as you can get it. I have, we'll talk about it, but some suggestions going forward. But yeah, I think like, you got Division One, Division Two, Division Three. Division One is kind of like the pinnacle where, Division Two or Division Three players ultimately might want to try to transfer up just to get more exposure. But honestly, you can find good players anywhere. I mean, for my alma mater, Buffalo State is just D3, and we had one guy transfer to Syracuse and then get drafted by Orlando City. So it's all possible. And, I mean, we had kind of talked about NAIA, which I think it's just a different governing body in its shortest terms. And it's kind of funny. I was like looking at it and I'm like, well, if people took the time to, kind of do what I do, but focus on NAIA and like JUCO specifically, like you could probably find some really good players. And obviously they end up coming up through Division One. We got like obviously Moise Bombito. And,
that's who I was thinking of. Yeah.
Ibrahim Kande was from the same JUCO. So like they have like a handful of really storied programs down there. Like Iowa Western, Monroe, Tyler, pretty successful over the past several years, and they obviously do produce really good players. And I think you see a lot of, especially international guys for NAIA, that just want to like keep playing, and it's probably, I assume it's because they love it, and you gotta go season by season and just see where you go, because even I'll give a little plug to USL League 2 because I mean they kind of go hand in hand with like the college guys all play in the summer, whether it's USL League 2 or NPSL. And you'll even find like Jack Stainrod from Dalton State. That's an NAIA school. Like he was a Sheffield United youth player, and he was one of the top performers in that summer league. So, these guys come from academies around the world, and yeah, I think the pathway anywhere, as long as you can try to get or like keep performing and keep getting noticed, you never know where you can end up. I think maybe the last thing I'll say for Division I focus, just for a sense of what the teams are comprised of. So you get a lot of like the top academy guys, whether it's ECNL, USL Academy, and obviously MLS Next. You get like some of the state like high school top performers, like obviously Ransford Guion is kind of the current guy who like just shines a light on the Gatorade like National Player of the Year, and you get a bunch of Gatorade State Players of the Year like KK Bafor with Notre Dame and things like that, and obviously you get a bunch of internationals from some of like all the top academies or top teams that you'll see in Europe. So like Tottenham, Bayer Leverkusen, Girona, Munich, like all over these guys. And it's kind of wild. Like some of them even like have played in the top tier of their home country in Europe. So yeah, these guys aren't like, it's not the days of, 30 years ago where these guys like really had no technical ability. And they're now telling you, oh yeah, I used to play D1
Yeah.
and the guys in a men's league. And you're like, this guy is brutally bad. Like, I think that might be what some fans envision because they have these like men's league stories of the guy who used to play D1 who's just not good at all. But this like new generation of players is, I mean, they're up there, and you can see why they translate to some extent, and even at the highest level.
You mentioned that technical ability there. So I want to get into kind of like the play style. I know it's very generalized to say like, oh, what's the play style of college soccer because there's so many different programs.
Yeah.
But for you, like from an outside point of view, I guess you could say you almost envision like these super muscular, strong American built players that just run fast and kick the ball as far as they can, the classic kick and run. But for you now that you've been able to really dive into these different programs, see how they play, see how coaches change from the technical side of training players, but also the tactical side of the way they move and so on. I'd love to hear a kind of a deep dive into that. Like, what are we looking at in terms of play style?
Yeah, it's quite a range, and it's kind of funny because you can get some success within all areas of that range. Like, I mean, I do think that there are quite a few programs around the country, and it's not like really even conference specific. Like the way they can pass and move, I always kind of say Wake Forest. They're always kind of like they give a pro style vibe in the way they can possess and pass and move, and they'll string together really good passages of play, and then also produce some really nice goals. And I think you can find that in a lot of programs, but then on the other side, it is like you said. I mean, Route One, it's just kickball style, like super messy, like teams, like all the players. It's like systematic for whatever reason. They like everybody on the team just they tap into the dark arts, and like they can be successful, and they might trick some fans because if you're not watching day in and day out, you're like, oh my God, that program's amazing. And then, one of my buddies, he was like watching this particular team, and he was like, you're right. It's painful to watch. And from a scouting standpoint, it's kind of tough because in systems like that, like those successful to a certain extent, like it sometimes I feel like the skill can be hidden because of
Mm.
the expectations of what the coach wants and the style of play in general. And they could be good players. It's just sometimes harder to see when, you're accustomed to what the eventual outcome of style of play, where it's cleaner, you know, you can tell the passing and moving and like the first touch is there and the way the passes are there. But when you're like, making things messy and it looks like 1980s English soccer, it's like, all right, tough to tell. But yeah, I think like overall, in we're seeing it like over, I mean, the past 10 years and especially the past like five, that players within the college game can translate pretty
Hmm.
well to along. And there's so many ways or places for them to go, like all the different tiers. So, like, I'm not saying that every college player can be an amazing MLS player or go abroad or things like that, but like, there's so many leagues that you can match the ability, and then it's just a case of or making sure that these guys get the opportunity to continue into the pros.
Would you say that like the majority of teams or a good percentage of like the high end teams have a comparable play style to some of the MLS? I know MLS also varies in terms of play style, but where they can translate, because you're saying they're getting better and better at being able to translate into MLS. But is that because like play style has changed, or the player as like an individual unit has just become better?
Um, I think the foundation is better. I've always kind of been critical of like, not to do a little bit of a tangent here, but everyone's always like, "Oh, pay for play is what's ruining this country." And to be honest, like we don't have the amount of pro teams around this country that can fund academies for free and
Mm-hmm.
like really attract some of the best players in different regions. Like, my Buffalo Niagara area, we still are like a year and a half or 2 years away from having a pro team. And like, even to this day, like exposure was pretty tough when I was growing up, but it's still even tough. Um, and I think in that, some of the coaching, I think, is some of the issue because, you know, club directors, a lot of the, they get the salary, and then some of these clubs are relying on volunteers who
Mm-hmm.
might not be, understand the philosophy of the club, or even the club might not even have one. So they don't even have a playing style anyway. And then, so how are you supposed to train to that? So the training sessions are, hit or miss. But I think like as time goes on and like our generation are moving into coaching and things like that, I think we'll continue to see just a better foundation for these players. And then just like the way colleges are able to attract a lot of the next academy players who need like maybe a year or two more of development to get into their early 20s before they return on a homegrown. So that'll increase the level as well. And there are some very phenomenal coaches in college, and I think that's from a player perspective an important thing for top players to understand is making sure that the system that they're going into is going to develop them and really showcase their style and ability and use it the right way. Um, so I think like more people will be finding, or players will be finding, better suited systems for themselves, and that's like the big key from the scouting perspective is like taking into account like the system, style of play. You're
Mm-hmm.
more so at that level, you're looking for skill sets, attributes. Like I say all the time, and half these guys, that are going to make the jump from college to pro, you're probably going to change your role or you're going to change your position altogether. And it's not a bad thing. Some positions in particular in college just won't ever translate, or just historically haven't. Like a 10, and like you could be in a phenomenal 10 in
Yeah.
college, but in MLS, like you're probably going to have to move out to the wing, kind of like a Chris Mueller, for example. But Um, yeah, I mean, not sure if I answered the question there, but
No, yeah, you did. In a roundabout way, you got
yeah,
to it. Before we get into sort of the draft process and how that all works, I want to get into some of the top teams. We mentioned even like the conferences historically that have done well, but maybe some of the top teams of this year. What's impressed you? Like you mentioned Wake Forest and their style of play, but I'm curious, even those that don't necessarily play a beautiful style of play, but are still doing well. I'd love to kind of dive into some of those programs before
yeah,
we
yeah, for sure. Well, I'll give you one more sentence or so on Wake Forest. I think like they're a team that they graduated a lot of guys that went to the pro level. So already they were trying to refit out their lineup, and you get some injuries inevitably throughout every season. So I think like with a slow start to their season, with the injuries, with having to replace like quite a few of their key players from last year, like winning an ACC championship was like no one probably picked them to do that. I know in the preseason poll they weren't like dead last in the voting or anything like that, because in the spring they had won the spring soccer cup, which is, I mean, it's still a competition. Like these guys, it might maybe have a little bit of an exhibition feel, which it's really not. Like these guys are hungry to play any competitive game they can get, especially when you can attach a trophy to it. But
Mhm.
yeah, I thought, all things considering, that was one of the maybe the overperformers. And obviously, with the games coming up here tonight, I think probably everybody in the College Cup could be deemed an overperformer. Um, Preseason poll for the Big Ten had like Ohio State at sixth, and partway through the season, you're like, my God, they're one of the more complete teams I've seen, and goals are coming from everywhere. Like they're just a really fun team to watch, like top to bottom. Like if you're a defender, you'll love watching them defend. Attackers, same thing, strong midfield, and they've like really put it together. And I think you know, seeing it now, it's like it looks like they should have been a favorite for a while, but it takes a little bit of time to get the engine moving. But yeah, I mean they've been sitting at number one for quite a while throughout the last half of the season, and yeah, I would say that they're up there for sure. And then even though Vermont brought back a lot of like really solid veteran players, and they won, I'm pretty sure they won the conference. Yeah, they did. I don't think at the start of the tournament people would have assumed that they'd be in the College Cup, but watching them play and the mix of some of the experience with some of the younger guys, I mean, they're they have as good of a shot as anybody. Probably not so much of a surprise, just with like the strength that they've had for so long, or at least over the past few years. But Marshall and Denver too, like they've just assembled like a pretty solid all around lineup. Kind of differing styles. Like you got a full international team, and then you got more of a U.S. domestic centric team. So again, like you can form a roster any given way,
Mhm.
play any given way, and you never know like who's going to rise to the top, because there's no like set formula on how to be successful. Um, let's see. I would say NC State and Dayton as well. Like NC State was in a situation where they had a new coach. They showed glimpses immediately with kind of the same roster as they had, like some turnaround. They made it to the Spring Soccer Cup final, losing in penalties. And then this season, I'm pretty sure the highest they got was 12th in the nation. But I mean, that's a huge turnaround from where they were a season ago, and making it to the national championship tournament again for the first time in a while. Um, so they're on the right track. I mean, Coach Hubbard's widely respected. So they'll be kind of a threat in the ACC for quite some time if they keep recruiting well. And and bringing more guys to keep reloading. But yeah, and then Dayton is another one of those kind of complete teams, fun to watch it on the attack. I think they finished their season pretty much top of all of Division One in terms of like chances created and things like that. So those are probably your overperformers in like a nutshell, but there's probably a ton of them.
And then another question just on that side of things before we get into the super draft. In terms of like transfers in this new age of recruitment, I know like if you're looking at the sort of college football side or college basketball, it's like complete chaos with NIL and so on. Where do you see it changing soccer now on the college soccer side, especially with the recruitment in terms of like just players can literally play at 4 different colleges in 4 different years? Like it's a pretty wild change from what it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pro transfer portal. Even when it like first started, because I just think of these players, anything to like benefit the player, to be honest, because you only have a handful of years to go through college. Like coaching changes, maybe you fall out of favor in terms of the style or things. And I've heard players talk about it before on podcasts and stuff, and you just got to go where you're going to be valued and appreciated, and because that leads to time spent in your development, opportunities to really showcase yourself. And I know like on the football side of things, like college football, people always talk about like, oh well, if you signed up to go to that college, you should stick it out. Just because you're not named the starter doesn't mean that you should just quit. And it's like, these guys got a shelf life though. Like, you, and I bring it all the way back to like, any student can transfer if they want. Like, why are we prohibiting student athletes from being able to do a similar thing? And then, even back in the day where, well, if you transfer, you got to sit out a year. It's like, I'm a big fan of the portal. It definitely makes things a lot more interesting. Like, especially with guys graduating, guys leaving early for the pros. It allows coaches to retool their roster pretty quickly, and if you can get a good group of guys in, it works for everybody. I know coaches probably are in certain instances where you don't want to see some of your players leave. That's tough, but
I think that'll improve quality though, right? In that sense, because then you're almost like destined. You have to kind of improve the program or try and switch things up in order to keep those players, if that makes sense on your end.
Yeah, and I think it holds coaches a little bit more accountable. They can't just be jerks to their players and expect them to stick around. Like, there's plenty of coaches out there who are very, very good to work with and have very positive reviews from other players and things like that. And like, you see them over the summers and you get to know other coaches, and you can see your game rise under different leadership. So, hopefully it kind of keeps in check some of the coaches as well. Like, some programs might just completely self-destruct if you just can't handle your team in a good way or play inspiring brand of soccer. So yeah, I mean, it definitely poses challenges. Like, I've heard, I think I won't be able to quote him, but Marlon LeBlanc, he was asked like, how he felt about the difference between being an ex-pro coach and a college coach, and he kind of alluded to just the recruiting challenges, and there probably is so many other aspects of coaching college soccer that's just not on the field, and it is a tough job. Like, I mean, you're building a roster for right now, a year from now, 4 years from now, and while also trying to get everyone up to speed, make sure the tactics are right. And I mean, it's complicated. I'm sure it's fun for some guys. Others, it might be more stressful, but yeah.
We'll get into the super draft then. So explain I if you're looking at it like from the American perspective, it's nothing really like the NFL draft or the NBA draft because it's not kind of the formal pathway to get into professional soccer. But then if you're looking at it from like the European perspective, you're like, what even is a draft? Like I have no idea what's going on here. So if you could just give us kind of a rundown of what that looks like, what the college showcase is, Generation Adidas contracts, all these different sort of aspects that you have around the draft itself.
Yeah. We'll start with the American viewership. And I've even seen like mock drafters kind of get aspects of the draft, of the super draft wrong because players don't declare for the draft. It's not like the NFL where, oh, well, is he going to come out and like declare for the draft? Like, so basically the way it works is every year there's an eligible players list, and that list is formed. So it's like probably 380 to 400 players, but for conversation, we'll just say 400. So of those 400 players, it's basically every club in the MLS creating a list of players from the college game that they're interested in potentially drafting. They send it to the league office. League office compiles them all, obviously removing duplicates, and then that's your eligible players list.
Mm-hmm.
So like you really have to be noticeable to even get on it. But it's also kind of funny. I've heard stories like guys end up on the eligible players list and like they wouldn't even have known if someone didn't tell them. Like, oh, dude, did you see you were on the eligible players list? They would have had no clue. So, yeah, it's not up to the players. It's, obviously you have to perform. So it is in their hands, but to a certain extent. But on top of that, like in the way some clubs do it, some really pay attention. Others maybe rely on coaches to give them lists. And then what I've like discovered too is like, agents will, have potential players that they're looking to represent, and they'll share that list with some of the clubs as well. And then that's how another group of players ends up on the list. But it's usually the same. Like agencies aren't really trying to represent players that aren't going to get drafted or things like that. And actually, one of the ways that it works is some agencies will call up the club and be like, hey, who are you interested in drafting? They don't know anything about the player, but then they'll be like in their DMs like, oh, well, like I love your style of play, because they know that they're on a draft radar. So that's like one of the aspects that I found interesting, because it's like a complete 180 from how I would do things, where I find a player that I really like and I'm like, this guy should be like seriously considered for the draft, and like, finding it that way rather than, going to the club and then approaching the player from there. Not that I'm an agent, but yeah, it's just kind of an interesting thing from that perspective. For GA contracts, obviously that changed a little bit last year. Sophomores are now eligible. So you don't, in the past, it was always, freshmen or sophomores. The only way that they could be drafted by a team would be through one of these GA contracts. And basically, it's not like, well, the simplest way to say for a GA contract, it's a multi-year guarantee. And let's see, there's like another aspect of it. Oh, yeah, you have to be nominated by a team to get it. So there's already been one signed for this year. I don't think it's been announced, but I think like 9 teams nominated the kid. So he was like a surefire GA. Then you get some of the freshmen in the showcase that are kind of like right on the fringe, to where they're kind of playing for the opportunity to be nominated for a Generation Adidas contract. But yeah, it's a little different than like your kind of league kind of minimum contract that some of these draft picks end up having to take, because it's you have a guaranteed like 3 years, depending on like at minimum. So that's like one of the aspects for that. It's pretty valuable for players. Like, I mean, just because at this point, anyone I feel like can get a GA deal. Like
Mm.
there's a sophomore who should be getting one. He doesn't need it to go pro, but it's a nice thing to have because again, it's a multi-year deal rather than like a 1+1 or a 2+1 type deal with like the club options and things like that. Because you see a lot of turnover with some of those. They're almost like trial contracts in a way. Like you're on a year-long trial, and then you potentially could get bounced out of the club pretty quickly.
Especially with MLS Next Pro now, like you're not even necessarily going to be with the first team. So now it's like, okay, you're getting drafted to have a trial with the second team preseason with the first team. And then after that year, if you're not good, then sort of see you later unless we need
Yeah,
you for another year or so.
exactly. And it's kind of a thing that we're seeing, and it's just kind of a little bit of an impatient business, I guess, because especially with the draft or this population, because you kind of have to prove your worth, because if you don't, we got another draft to do, and we're gonna take three more players or more, or well, or less, I guess. But yeah, new players will come in every year, and a lot of the spots like aren't long term
Mhm.
until you really show that you're making a good progress and that you can translate to being a real first team type player. And that's ultimately the goal for half of these teams. But
So we were speaking about like college programs that do successful in terms of play style and so on. I'm curious players now that translate into the pro game, specifically sort of the MLS now. What are the players that you sort of see make the most sense positionally and also like technically as a player themselves?
like this year or kind of
Yeah, we can.
historically?
Yeah, let's go into this year, but then also historically to kind of give a good balance.
Yeah, I've posted about quite a few of them. I think kind of with like the theme of what teams look for. Skill is obviously important, but the elite physical profile is also very important. And I think some guys like Hakim Karamoko, he's still only 19. Like he just turned 19 last month, and he's already played 2 years of college soccer, and that dude's a force. Winger, I mean, honestly, I think he's even told me that he'd be open to playing wingback if that meant that if they needed him to. But
Hmm.
yeah, he's just a beast. He can play. He can play in a two striker system as well, like providing that pace. But like he's up there for sure, just with like the physical attributes and still a load of potential. That I say, I mean, there's still so much to see about this kid that you know just imagine where a guy like that'll be in 2 or 3 years when he's like 22 and really in the first stage of his prime. Um, Kind of fitting that too is center back that I just really like. I've been a huge fan, but Charlie Harper. He's an Australian who grew up in Japan. 6'2", 6'3" center back. I mean, the dude can fly. Like at the combine, he was the second highest vertical by quite some. Like it was him and Ka from Cornell that just kind of jumped out of the gym. But on top of that, like back in before he came over to the States, he was a track guy, ran like a, a 10-8 100-meter dash, and like it looks like it on the field too. I think he translates for sure. He's got a UK passport, so his preference is the MLS to start. But I mean, there's even talks of like Socceroos U23 already. So just with what he's been able to show, he hasn't gotten like as much recognition, maybe in like the all conference type stuff. But I mean, he's a solid player, very very smart, 2-footed. Um, yeah, definitely top center back prospect. I think. I'm trying to think of some of the other like super top guys. Obviously, Joran Gerbet from Clemson. He's just so smooth on the ball. I mean, he's not going to blow you away with pace or anything, but if you're talking about somebody who never looks stressed at all, and I've heard over the past couple of days that some of the GMs or technical staffs, they're like, man, that dude, he's got to be one of the top performers, because I think the feedback that I got was, in those 11 aside games for the showcase, some of these guys, inevitably there's pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So they might feel a little bit like frantic or a little bit unorganized, but like Joran's just Joran. Like that dude, he's doing his like spin moves, protecting the ball. It's like super mindful play, perfect like deep lying playmaker. And if you put him in a system in the MLS with like, I call them all action eights, some guys who can really do some dirty work around the midfield and like lay it off to him. Like he's good with his positioning, like he'll intercept and stuff, and he can halt traffic and get numbers behind the ball. I wouldn't say he's like known for his tackling or anything, but he kind of doesn't have to be. I mean, there's not too many people that I would say are known for like incredible defensive presence while also being one of the best passers in all of college. So he's obviously up there in terms of being an international. Some prospect guys that it'll be probably another year, just out of the education aspect. But Alex Harris, he's like lightning quick, can play a bunch of different positions. He's one for the future for sure. Like he was probably close to a GA deal last year, but then again, like I think he intends on finishing his Cornell degree. So that plays a factor. And then maybe there were concerns because, I mean, he's still only a teenager. So one of those guys for the future that should probably be a top first round pick, like in that top half. And then the team will probably just like sit on his rights and maybe invite him into the summer training and things like that. Because he's another guy like doing what he's doing now. Imagine him at 23 and 24 when he really fills out. Like he's got the foot speed and like the quick trigger, and he can score at will. So it's just a case of maturing. And there's a lot of guys that I think are kind of like that. I'm going to end up publishing kind of like if I were to run a team and I could only pick college guys from this year. So there will be some homegrowns in there, internationals, but with the MLS roster rules. So only eight internationals out of 30 slots. And, do my typical starting 11 with the bench, like senior roster, supplemental roster, things like that. So that'll be a decent indication, I think, of who I think translates to the pro game, and then kind of mix in a couple prospects for a year or two down the road. So that's something, I guess, to stay tuned to.
I want to get into, there's obviously some teams that are going to be there watching and sort of build, I wouldn't say build their MLS programs off of college players, but have a real focus on developing kind of that college style player. And then you have teams like Philadelphia Union who just trade away all their picks every single year. So can you talk to me about sort of maybe not the behind the scenes of how those recruitment departments work, but what their thought patterns are, why some teams are going to say, hey, we're just completely ignoring the draft. Others are going to do it just to be there. And then others are actually going to be fully involved and trying to get something good out of it.
Yeah. And that trade right there is kind of the dichotomy of, a team that really values the draft and then another who doesn't. It doesn't necessarily mean, I will say this, it doesn't necessarily mean that like the Union won't value the college game. It's just going to manifest in a different way. I think ultimately it helps in the recruitment of their academy because when you are going around trying to find all the top talent to bring into your academy, those guys won't have to look over their shoulder every year when they're making their way up to the next pro level, wondering who's this next group of players coming in and like potentially taking my spot. And like obviously the college game will never go away for a lot of these guys because, and I think the Union specifically, or since we're talking about them, like you'll have the Nick Perianos of the world or the McKenzies, like whether it's 1 year or full 4 years in college. So, and like Daniel Kruger at Wake Forest, he's been doing well out of the Union Academy. So I think you'll see guys within the academy go to college and round out at least a couple years just so like because the competitiveness and the physicality of college can be a little bit more tougher than maybe an X Pro, where some games almost kind of feel exhibition style. But yeah, you really have to fight in college. And when you think about the guys on the existing roster, like if I'm a senior and this next pro or this next academy kid comes in, like I don't care what academy you came from. It's like my starting spot that you're threatening. Yeah. So like you're having a battle for minutes on the field within your own team, and then on top of that, like just the actual games themselves, like you get so much experience that you probably wouldn't get, being a teenager in next pro where might feel a little bit more relaxed. I'm sure there's some physical games in it, but by and large, that's kind of the benefits of that game. So you'll see the Union using the college game in that regard, but then also flipping back and doing homegrown deals from there. And then I think the biggest thing for teams' enthusiasm around the draft is it is academy based. So, some teams based on their location or, the level of their recruitment, their academies throughout all the age groups just aren't going to be as strong because they just can't find or attract like the type of players that they need to bring in. So that's where they really love having a shot at this draft because, they have the space to accommodate the college players. They're totally fine and enthusiastic about developing them. And then, at the end of the day, they're free. So you're not spending any money on them. If you can make them into first team roster players, they've already paid for themselves. And then in the best case scenario for some of these teams, it's like two paths. You sell them for a solid fee, or they become like a 6 to 10 year player and you never have to worry about that position again, or well, at least over that course of time. And especially if you can get a good U.S. domestic player in there, because obviously the rules are the rules. Like you're going to have to field U.S. players, and one of the best ways to do it in terms for me is guys that have played with some college background out of what I'm talking about, where the physicality and just the schedule. Like half these teams are playing like 2 games a week, and it can get intense depending on what the opponent is.
I want to get into the like what you would change or how you would adapt the draft. I think there's many ways that we can look at kind of switching it up or trying to at least innovate in different ways. And I think they have over the years kind of switched things up a little bit. So I'm curious from your side, what would you do? How would you adapt it?
Yeah. So for the draft, I'd probably, and I'm sure they'll do it. Like I'm pretty sure Adidas, they're still a part of the whole generation Adidas thing, but even that's changed over the years. I think the funding's a little different. Like at one point, I think Adidas was paying a pretty substantial percentage of that contract, but they've kind of brought it back a little bit. So maybe one day that whole system goes away, which would, cause the ripple of just open it up to every college player. So you can draft a freshman. You don't need to, offer or nominate them for a GA contract. So that might be advantageous. I think one of my biggest things, and it's not really even draft specific, it's college specific. So I see quite a few players that come up through MLS academies. They go to school for like 4 or 5 years, and at the tail end of their college career, they still don't know where they stand with their club. So, from a player perspective, it's like you just feel stuck. Like you could have probably gone pro 2 or 3 years prior, but you're waiting on a club to make a decision on if they want to give you a homegrown deal. And from like the way I think about it is it it's just not very friendly to the player. So I've like said it for quite a while now, but maybe if it were something like if a player from your academy goes to a university, you have to make a decision like on or before their 21st birthday because we can't be having 23-year-olds
Mm.
finally being able to start their professional opportunities. So, in a way, sometimes like I know there's obviously a lot of benefits to being in an MLS academy, but like on the long term, you shouldn't really be punished for having grown up in one. It's like I don't know. So kind of tough to determine if you'd want to do it by what class they're in, just because of red shirts and things like that or injuries. So I always just say, by their 21st birthday, they should have autonomy to either go or just be available to other teams in the draft. Because ultimately, like I just want players to be able to go to teams that really value them.
Yep.
So, I mean, the long term, and I don't know, it's fun. Like I love the draft, but part of me also thinks that like from the player perspective as well, like it's just not that great because like you don't really know where you're going to go. You don't really know if they really want you or if you're kind of just there to round out a roster for a year and then your contract isn't really that great. You know, if you're a pro athlete and you're forced to have a roommate. But well, I mean, I guess they do like housing stipends and stuff, but still, like having more of a decision on where you can go would be a lot better. I mean, it takes away the fun and the surprise of like who goes where, which that aspect's always going to be cool. But yeah, in terms of their long term career, it kind of hinders it sometimes. But I mean, we'll see.
And I think the league as a whole doesn't really like invest in wanting to make the draft something. Like I feel like if you had that NFL aspect where it's got that showmanship of like,
Yeah,
oh, like you're saying, who's gonna go where, what's gonna happen, who's gonna trade, like making movies around it. Like there's a really big thing about sort of American sports in the draft. And MLS, I don't know. I don't see
yeah, it's
like.
like
Do you
on
see a
YouTube
future
or
where
whatever.
the draft just isn't there?
Well, I think this year will be an interesting indicator to see like
Mm,
how much effort they put in. Because I mean, last year I think it was like Tiger Smalls or somebody who was like drafted and like it totally took everyone by surprise in the booth. Like they were talking about like other players and things that never even ended up getting drafted, and they were like, "Oh, so Charlotte took this guy from LMU," and they're like scrambling to pull
yeah.
up like highlights, and like the highlights weren't actually a good representation of what he does. So yeah, they were like kind of scrambling and trying to fill airtime, and it wasn't like very well prepared in certain aspects. But like I've told people it's like, well, if they make more effort to kind of create that showmanship and the research behind it, and they know a little bit more about these players, so they aren't like surprised when somebody gets drafted, uh, then that might be an indicator that if there's progress in the coverage, then it might be
Mm.
something that the league's like, look, we need to do this right. We need to try to beef this up a little bit, make it more into a spectacle. Because if they start valuing it, or at least showing that they're valuing it, then it'll probably stick around for quite a while. But you know, I mean, the women's league, they got rid of theirs, um, so it's not like it hasn't happened. But yeah,
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens. I want to get your wildest prediction of this draft. I know you don't really want to go down the route of like guessing who's going to go where, what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But just as a whole, do you see something like stirring up now, where you could see sort of something happen that like you said, people aren't expecting, and you might not be the typical that goes on.
Yeah. And like I said on Twitter, I mean, I'm not doing a mock draft out of
Mhm.
respect for like the handful of teams that, and like I know who represents um, or is kind of set. Like there might not be written agreements, but people have an idea of who they could work with if they end up getting called and they want to pursue a pro opportunity. But like talking to a bunch of people, I mean, there's definitely a core group of players that a lot of teams will be jostling for. So, I mean, there's inevitably like trades, but
Mhm.
I mean, I think um, I wouldn't be surprised personally if there was a lot of movement to get into like those top five spots. Um, so I don't know how that will ultimately look because I know some teams are like very firm on holding their ground because they really want some of these players. And like I said, I mean, for the one GA kid, um, when nine teams nominate you, that means they all want you. They're not just doing it for fun.
Yeah.
So like Gam might be flying, you know,
We saw, I
Peck,
think it was last year, Charlotte jumped up to first, right? I
yeah,
feel like I remember them trading up to first
uh, yeah. That might have been 2 years. Yeah, 2 years
2 years
ago.
ago now.
They had
Okay.
me Diop. Yeah. Um, so not sure if San Diego will do that. They already got an additional first round pick, so I think they love their chances at number one. And even with Hamity or making those moves in the expansion draft, like they definitely have some targets, and I actually like what they're doing. Like the youth or like a younger team, energetic, coachable with like some of the when your oldest experienced guy is like in the like 27, 28. That's like a pretty good spot to keep a young roster. And then so yeah, between trades and then from the fan perspective, like there's going to be guys that you look at the NCAA goals and assists, and they're like, "Oh my god, this player's amazing," and like, yeah, they're good players, but like some of the fan favorites might see themselves drop. So like where. I mean, you'll have some fans like pulling their hair out, being like, "Why isn't this guy being drafted?" Like, "Oh my god!" And there's a lot of factors that it's not just the play that is playing into factor for these teams, like international slots,
Yep.
and the fan demand to sign international players that are higher value and more proven, and then like the age factor, like it just comes into like the potential, like how much more will this player grow if he's like beating up on everyone as a 24-year-old against 20-year-olds. Like, yeah, he's a good player, but like what can we really do with him long term? Or is he transcendent enough to hop into our first team? Because I always say for some of these guys that I talk to, like the players, once you hit 23, if you I just don't see too many guys above 23, no matter if you're American or international, that you're just going to be an ex pro journeyman for 2 years and then you're going to be like babysitting the teenagers. So, until MLS creates MLS League Two or whatever, and they create like a second tier or whatever, and then kind of spin off next pro to be more of like a U20 developmental league. Um, I think that those type of guys would be better suited like in the USL Championship, which I've always been like kind of wondering why they don't go after more college guys, but they usually wait until I feel like they usually wait until after the MLS like takes them over for like a year or two, and then when they get bounced out of MLS, they're like, oh yeah, yeah, we'll take you. But it's like you could skip all that and just take the guy now. But I mean, MLS is more ambitious when it comes to the college guys. Um, so, I mean, yeah. And then your CPL, we got to get them up and running. They already got a few, so just need to keep on the gas because the
Yeah.
more pathways, honestly, the
Yeah.
better. But yeah, we've talked about that before.
Yeah, no, you're spot on there. We'll wrap things up here with some quick fire questions. I want to know your favorite draft pick of all time. I know there's the likes of, like, you got Dempsey, you got Jack Harrison, Kyle Larin on the Canadian side. I'm curious for you, what's your number one?
Yeah, wow. I'll give you maybe four real quick because I go off board. My favorite's probably Christian Roldan.
Mm,
Um, if you can get a guy from college who's going to be a stalwart, help win you trophies, and be kind of like, make enough appearances with the national team to where he's not always away from your team, but also like has that experience. I mean, winning the Champions Cup, MLS Cups, all that, and like some gold cups with the U.S. is awesome. Like I love seeing that type of stuff. I know he's not like doing the flashy big money move to Europe, but staying in theme of guys who come from college, they become like over 200, 250 appearances for the MLS first team. Like that's so valuable, especially as
mm,
an American. So I also love Matt Polster, Keegan Rosenberry, and then always like, I mean, Brandon Bai was like my first real scouting achievement, I guess you could say, because like in 2016 he had a good year, and I was like, dude, you got to watch this kid. He's legit, and he goes on to have a better 2017. And then he goes to the combine, like impresses everybody, and goes 8 overall. And I'm like, man, I had him tabbed 2 years prior. That feels so good. That's when I felt like I might have an eye for that stuff. But so that goes back to back then. So he's always one of my favorites to kind of throw into this mix. Because again, like I think he's probably over 150. I know he got injured for a little bit, but yeah, solid player. And yeah, American. So
yeah.
good for the roster.
I was going to say, so going alongside that, if you were starting your own team, you mentioned how you're going to do sort of like a draft in terms of how you would build that roster, but just one player. What's one player from this draft that you would build your team around? Or does that give away too much?
I'll do one position group just because I've already talked pretty in length of Charlie Harper, but he'd be left center back. Tate Johnson, his teammate at UNC, as left back. Right center back, probably Max Floriani, just solid tackler. He takes the terms no turn very seriously. Like if you try to post up on him, you're not really going to turn on him. So I like that type of aggression and cleanliness in the tackle and in duels. Right back, like I've been high on him for a while. I think maybe some other MLS teams are getting interested, but Willie Cardona at Virginia Tech, like I've seen him over the summer. He's such a class player and a little under the radar because they weren't like a super like glamorous program to watch because kind of mid table. So that's my back line, and then Trace Alfin's always like everyone knows I like him because the acrobatic saves, his footwork on the ball, like. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like you see him on video and you're like, oh, well, he seems kind of small, but in person, he is a true 6'2", and that's pretty right on average. So yeah, he's not as undersized as people think. And then, I mean, the dude can fly through the air. So I'd be interested to see what his like vertical is or kind of that like lateral jumping or diving. But yeah, as an American keeper for sure. The years of experience he's had in the ACC and just the consistency and he's just a fun guy to watch for sure if you like goalkeepers. So yeah, I'll give you that.
That's good. No, that's more than I could ask for. The next one here, what's a common or the biggest misconception for college soccer that is just totally not true?
mean, kind of the stuff that we covered, I think, like
Mm.
that they're just like dudes off the street, or like maybe the people who, they go to high school and they're, or like currently in high school or a little bit outside of it, they just think of like the one guy on their high school team that's going to go D1, and he goes to some bottom of the barrel team, and they just like, oh well, it's just some dude. But no, the fact that these guys are coming from really strong academies, and if they didn't, they're there for a reason. Like if you're an ECNL national guy who winds up on a top like D1 roster like Tyler Trimnell, like he didn't need to go to, Charlotte FC Academy, even though it happened after he had left high school. But yeah, like these guys in the facilities that they have at a lot of these campuses, they're better than some teams around the world, like some of these second or third tier areas. So I mean, again, you get a lot of the international top academy guys coming over here, and I think our guys can compete with them, and it ultimately raises the level for everybody. So yeah, I think like I would just say people need to like either go to a game or just kind of watch a couple games here and there, but also to be smart about it, because I wouldn't want your first experience to be one of those kickball teams. But yeah.
The last one here before we wrap things up. If you could sit down with one person for a meal, who would it be and why? It could be past or present.
I'll stick with the present. And so before Big Oil or whoever took over Newcastle, I grew up a Newcastle fan. So and Alan Shearer seems like a hilarious dude. I think we'd get on pretty well. So yeah, if it was him, maybe he'd bring along Scott Parker or something. But yes, one of the icons from my childhood, I'd probably want to like hear some stories about, behind the scenes, and especially the guys that are still a part of the game in some capacity. So yeah.
Mark, I appreciate your time. Before we wrap things up quickly, I just want to get if you want to shout out like your ex or whatever you're working on. I know we sort of have the live stream in the work, so we'll keep everyone updated on that side. But if you want to shout out your side, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, sure. So my name on here, that's my Twitter, just without the space. So at Mark Kelkenberg. I have a Substack, but that's usually just LinkedIn, certain posts and things like that. But I mean, that's probably one of the better places to just reach me in general. And then the YouTube account is Kelken Sport. It just houses a lot of my overall scouting highlight videos for a lot of, mainly centered around college players. It's just whenever I have the time I can do it. But yeah, I think after the draft is when I'll have like some more of the guys to like keep tabs on for the even leading into the spring that like don't get drafted or so. There'll be more recaps for a lot of people to get an early preview of who to look out for in 2025.
Mark, thanks again for your time, and we'll speak again soon.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, man.
Wanna hear you go.